Good evening. Welcome to our Shir on Parashat Acharei Mot. It's after the break, so I welcome you back. We're also competing with the Raptors, so best of luck to them. And we'll do a brief review of the Parsha. The first part of the Parsha talks about the Yom Kippur service. We've had the opportunity in the past many times to review, to analyze, to learn, to be inspired by the Yom Kippur service. And the later section of the Parsha talks about immorality, forbidden relationships, and that's section number 2 of the Parsha. So number 1, we'll share a discussion that we've had in the past in detail that relates to the Seir Hamishtalech, the goat, right? The he-goat, that on Yom Kippur, the most significant day on the calendar, is given to an individual designated for the task of taking this he-goat away from Jerusalem, away from Yerushalayim, to a location which is identified as the Azazel in the wilderness. And when it reaches that location, this he-goat is pushed over, as tradition teaches us. And this service is a very unique one because it carries upon it, this goat, the scapegoat, carries upon it the avonotam, the sins of the people of Israel, el eretz gzera, right? Some area that's uninhabited. And by sending away this seir, there's atonement. Now, for us to address things that we cannot fully comprehend is nothing new. Judaism is a religion where we have an understanding. There are many things that God Almighty gave us the tools to appreciate and understand. Yes, there's a rational section to Judaism, but there are also many laws that the human being cannot comprehend. And our commitment to faith is based on an understanding that there is a creator. There are things we are willing to do because we are committed to him, even if we don't understand why or how they function. There's nothing shocking there. And there's nothing shocking about services that are done with animals, sacrifices. So many details in the Torah talk about things in the Bet HaMikdash that no one could give me full insight into why a specific service is done with the blood of one animal and not with the blood of another animal. And we have no difficulty with it. But when suddenly we talk about a service that is done outside of the Bet HaMikdash, and we are told that this goat being sent away somehow brings atonement because it carries upon it all the sins of the people of Israel. It's a little bit of a difficult one. What's the idea behind it? And when you start going through midrashim and rabbinic sources, there's some level of clarity. So let me share with you the insight that personally talks to me more than any other explanation. So this is an insight to appreciate the concept of a he-goat. Now you have to remember that this scapegoat was not chosen on its own, but as we read in this week's Parsha, and as we review every single Yom Kippur, that the Kohen takes 2 he-goats. He stands them before Hashem at the entrance of the tent. The high priest will take lots upon the he-goats, one to Hashem and one to Azazel. So They appear to be chosen randomly. The one that was chosen to God is brought as an offer, la Hashem, in a very traditional way, how we bring korbanot in the Bet HaMikdash. The second one turns into the scapegoat. Now, with that in mind, I think that the best explanation can be built based on a statement in the Talmud. The Talmud tells us, it's a rabbi, I think Rabbi Alexandri tells us, that you should know that deep down, the Jewish person desires to do good. I think it's a very Jewish approach that people really are good. People are good. And it's a healthy attitude because when I suddenly interact with someone that I don't know, I walk in with an assumption that they have good intentions. And yes, perhaps there are experiences that they went through that caused them gives them a little bit of a rough edge. But the Jewish outlook is that people are really good. And that's what Rabbi Alexandri tells us, that people are good. And they want to fulfill their responsibility towards God, towards humanity, towards the Jewish people, towards the world. Mi me'akev, asked the Talmud, what prevents the good person from doing good? So two explanations are presented. Number one, seor shebe'isa. What is a seor shebe'isa? Well, these are leavening agents that are placed into dough that cause them to rise. What is that a symbol of? So in our tradition, the seor that causes bread to rise, the yeast, right, the sourdough, became a symbol of the evil inclination. Why? Well, it's a symbol of making something desirable, desire. Desire is what prevents us from fulfilling our responsibility. Desires. Now, again, desires, when channeled appropriately, are an incredible tool. If you have a desire to eat, well, eat a healthy meal, you'll have energy, and you can be in a good mood and do good things. Daven, learn Torah, do acts of kindness, commit yourself to the community. There are a lot of good things you could do that are built upon desire. But desire is dangerous. Desire, often, when not controlled, and together with human weaknesses, could cause people to stumble. The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. So this rabbi tells us that there are two things that prevent us from fulfilling our responsibility. Number one, the evil inclination. The evil inclination. Sometimes we make bad decisions. Sometimes we have our honor that's hurt, and as a result, we're not going to act appropriately towards the individual that insulted us. Sometimes we have jealousy. And when someone else is experiencing something good, and you don't interact with them in a positive way because you have those negative feelings, that's a Yetzer Hara. Sometimes we're tempted. Sometimes we're lazy. Yetzer Hara, that's problem number one, and it needs to be addressed. How is it addressed? Well, there's a Yom Kippur service where we come to the Bet HaMikdash. We are inspired by the service, by the prayer, opportunities to meditate, to remind ourselves of what's important, what are we here for, and that gives us the tools to work on self-improvement. That's the human journey. We make mistakes, but we accept ourselves after the mistakes because God accepts us. And we have the opportunity to fix the beauty of Yom Kippur, the day you could fix things, okay? And, when a few days ago, the Toronto Public Library announces that your fees are gone. I don't know to what extent, but your late fees are all gone. Your record is clear. Come back to the library, says the mayor, because you have to no longer worry about that book that you did not return in 1976. So my wife Miriam points out that that's the attitude we're supposed to have towards Yom Kippur. Come back to God. You can have a relationship with him. right? Just as there were studies that people were not coming or utilizing libraries because they knew that they have this fee that they would have to address. It's clear. Welcome back. That's Yom Kippur. It's magnificent. But that's only one reason for people to not fulfill their responsibility towards God. So back to the Talmud. The Talmud asks the question, what prevents a person from fulfilling their responsibilities? Number one, Yetzer Hara. Number two, Shiabud Galiot, the burden of exile. The burden of the exile. The exile is a burden. We're not where we belong. It's a fact. We don't belong here. We belong in Israel, and even in Israel, it's still an exile. Things are not perfect there. Things are going to be better. We're optimistic. And quite often, our inability to do what we are supposed to do is the burden of the exile. And the Talmud wants us to know that, because sometimes a person might have the tendency to blame themselves completely for everything that is wrong in their life. But the truth is, you're not always to blame. And the truth is, even mistakes, even avonot, even chataim, even sins that we perform at times, we're not to blame. Yes, there are things where we made a bad decision, but there are circumstances that because I'm in a galut, because I'm burdened with I don't have this connection to the place I live. I'm always moving. I don't have the stability. I'm in an environment where the Jewish person does not belong. And as a result, I'm not calm. And as a result, sometimes due to the weakness that brings, that the environment brings about, I make bad decisions. There are times that you are not to blame. You know who is to blame? This state of exile. That's what the Talmud is telling us. And that is symbolized by the Seir La'azazel, this he-goat that's sent away. And we say, you know what? There are sins that this entity symbolizes them. That is a seir. You know, there's a fascinating state midrash that the Ramban shares with us. And the Ramban, sharing the midrash, tells us that when the Torah tells us that this he-goat carries upon it the avonotam, says the midrash, v'nasa seir, the he-goat shall carry. Do you know who the seir represents? Ze Esav. It represents Esav, as stated regarding him, Achi ish seir, my brother. In the context where that verse appears, it's talking about the fact that Jacob bemoans the difficulty of getting dressed up as Esav because Yaakov Achi ish seir is hairy, and I'm not. But the term seir, it's not a coincidence, but rather the he-goat has a name that is similar to the state of Esav because it represents Esav. And why are we in exile? And who was the first one that sent a Jewish person into exile? Seir, Esav. And by the way, the Midrash continues. The Midrash tells us that this Seir carries upon it avonotam, their sins. And the Midrash tells us that you could break the word avonotam to avonot tam, the sins of the person who was called Ishtam, Yaakov. And what the he-goat is all about is to teach us a message then, 2,000 years ago in a Bet HaMikdash, and today, that yes, there are things that you need to work on Yom Kippur and every day. There are areas of improvement, and we are given the opportunity to improve. But there are things that are beyond your control, and you send them away. Don't blame yourself for the fact that you are going through difficulty. Today was Yom HaShoah. And as we know very well, every day really is a Yom HaShoah. We should always be commemorating. A day should not go by where we don't forget. And we should be proud of the fact that today everyone focuses on it because it's so important. We know it. We need the next generation to hear about it. And when you think about the long-term damage of the Shoah, long-term damage, do you know how many people who are children of survivors, who have many difficulties and challenges due to the fact that their parents went through hell? And do you know that there's difficulty for children of survivors? And sometimes they do things that perhaps they shouldn't. Now, do you think they're to blame? I don't. Why? Galut, exile, Hitler Yimach Shemo, Esav, Seir. Don't blame yourself for the fact that you couldn't deal with a specific situation when it is really due to the fact that in your childhood, you had to live with people that couldn't share their emotions because they went through things that they couldn't express. Don't blame yourself. There are things that you need to send away. Yeah, there are areas that you try to improve and you work on it. That's the Jewish journey. That's the Seir La Hashem. You bring a korban, you meditate, you feel close to God. He go to God is a message that we can reconnect to him through improvement, through the path of tshuva. But there are things we are sending away. It's not us. We're not to blame. And I can tell you, I've interacted with many people who are survivors, children of survivors. And it's a feeling that this message is a very significant one. You're not to blame. There are things that the Talmud tells us. Shiabud Malchiyot, it is the Galut that's to blame. I didn't make this up. It's in the Talmud. It's fundamental to believe things that you could change, things that you can't. Here's the symbolism, a very important one, in my opinion. So this is a vort, not more than a vort. I don't like the term vort so much because vort is something that's just like one word. This is a message of living, right? This is a message of living that our Parsha teaches us, a very significant one. Now, I'm going to move forward in the Parsha, where this is chapter 18 of Vayikra, where the Torah starts talking about the forbidden relationships, control in sexual matters, which is something that is very much part of our tradition. But we're going to focus more on a verse that introduces this section. A very interesting verse that brought about a lot of discussion throughout the ages. The Torah tells us, beginning of chapter 18, Vaidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, and tell them, listen here, you people have roots in a country called Egypt. You, the people, are making your way into the land of Canaan. But the problem is that both these cultures were quite corrupt. And therefore, I need to warn you, the Jew has a tendency of connecting with the society around him. It is something that comes from a good place. We feel a responsibility to humanity. We want to learn because deep down we want to teach, which is a connection. But the Torah warns us that you should know, fellows, you people came from a very problematic region, and you are entering into a land that has behaviors that are quite destructive. And therefore, in verse 3, God warns us, Kema'aseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshavtem ba. You should know that the practices of the Egyptians must be uprooted. Don't be like the Egyptians. And so too, Kemaase Eretz Canaan. And so too, when it comes to the practices that are followed in the land of Canaan, to which I'm going to bring you, lo ta'asu, don't follow them as well. They're destructive. And then the Torah adds, ubechukotehem, and that's something we're going to focus on. Ubechukotehem, their statutes, right? Their traditions. Lo telechu, don't follow the traditions, the statutes that they have. Don't follow the chok of these nations. Now, what exactly is the chok referring to? In other words, if we're just being told, don't be corrupt like them, don't steal like them, don't be promiscuous like them, so the Torah could just state that. What exactly are the chukim? What exactly are these chukim referring to? So there's a section in the Talmud that tells us that there is a violation of Jewish law if you follow something, if there is something that is done by the pagans, if there's a specific practice done by the pagans, you are not to follow them. Okay, because we want to distance ourselves from them. We don't want to be like them. Remember, this is a paganism that's not just considered wrong, but destructive. The Torah tells us, right? They offer their children, their parents as sacrifices. It's destructive. And even perhaps in one generation that might appear nice and fine and cultured, avodah zarah, in essence, long-term, is destructive to the world. And we are here to uproot it. We're here to teach a religion that's based on the fact that there's a higher being, there's a value of life. It is not centered as many avodah zarah is on a human being creating some kind of practice where there are no guidelines and no limitations. Avodah zarah is to be uprooted. If the pagans have a specific practice, you avoid it. Now comes a problem. If we are being told that we are not to do things that the pagans do, we might run into some trouble. Because what if the pagans, for example, start wearing shirts, pants, suits, right? Is that going to suddenly make it prohibited? In other words, there must be guidelines here when we are being told, don't follow the chok, don't follow these actions of the pagans. What's included, what's not included? So this dilemma was addressed by a great rabbi in Italy in the 15th century. His name was Rabbi Yosef Colon. And Rabbi Yosef Colon was dealing with Jewish physicians that had to don this distinctive robe worn by the Gentile colleagues as well. And they asked the rabbi if Jews were historically not wearing this specific this robe of physicians, and now we are doing it as the non-Jews do, the Christians, is there a problem? That's a very good question, but his answer is a fundamental one. And he says the following, that, listen, there are two ways to define actions or garments of the Gentiles that are problematic. Number one, if it is something that's pre-suit, in other words, if it is a garment that it shows immorality, okay, that would clearly be problematic. But then he states, and this is the important part, that you should know, we only violate the prohibition of following a chok, right? A tradition of pagans, only if it is something that is irrational. If it is irrational. If Gentiles do something rational, there's nothing wrong with it. If, let's say, theoretically, Gentiles develop, or pagans develop these boots that when you wear them, you stay warm and you stay dry. A Jew is allowed to wear it because it is rational in the cold winter to want to keep your feet dry and warm. If Gentiles go ahead and develop some kind of construction mechanism, and as a result, their houses start looking different, if it's rational because it's a better structure, it insulates better, it's more sturdy, there's nothing wrong because it's rational. The problem of a chok is only if they are doing something that we have no explanation for it. It is something that's considered irrational, then it's problematic. Therefore, Rabbi Kolon told the physicians that there is absolutely no problem for them to wear the robes worn by their Gentile colleagues, because it's rational that people should know who is a doctor, who's not. And if you graduated medical school and people need to know that you could be turned to address medical needs, obviously it is okay. And that's basically why, we feel comfortable wearing suits and ties and garments and clothes, even if the designer was not Jewish, because, there's nothing there that's irrational. Just, it's worn, it looks normal. Ramosha Feinstein was once asked about European garments, and he wrote that it was never something that was established for Gentiles only. In other words, to go ahead and start wearing garments that priests do. In other words, if I decide that rabbis should start looking like the Pope with red shoes and his odd hat, that would be problematic because there's perhaps nothing rational about those garments. But when garments don't relate at all to a specific culture, Moshe says, and in his words, lo nikva mitchila lanochrim, it was not established specifically for Gentiles, there's no violation of the law. Okay, so this is an area of Jewish thought called not following the chok of the Gentiles. Now, what I'm going to focus on tonight, is on a very early rabbinic statement. It predates the Mishnah. It is one of the earliest oral traditions that's recorded that analyzes these words, ubechukotehem lo telechu. People of Israel, do not follow the statutes, do not follow the traditions of the Gentiles. And specifically, remember, this is a nation that's leaving Egypt and making its way to Canaan. And specifically, this rabbinic source is going to be addressing practices that were common in Egypt and common in the land of Canaan as well. So comes the Torat Kohanim. This is a midrash of halacha, and says the following. Do you want to know about the norms and the chukim, these traditions that existed in the land of Mitzrayim and Canaan? So the Midrash tells us, you want to know ma hayu osim. Do you know what was done in these areas, in these regions? And remember, this is an introduction to a parasha that is talking about sexual violations. Ha'ish noseh le'ish. Men married men. Ha'isha le'isha. Women married women. So therefore we are told, ubechukotehem lo telechu. Don't follow such traditions. Don't make it a chok. Interesting. So when it comes to same gender marriages, the Torah is telling us that this is a problem that they encountered in that region. And the Torah warns us, don't follow it. Don't follow it. Don't have a marriage if they are the same gender. Now, My question is that why is that called a chok? Do you know that the definition of a chok in our tradition is something that is irrational? In other words, if I develop a specific dance to bring rain and you cannot explain it rationally, that is a chok. And the word chok relates, or it originates from the word lechokek, which is to engrave. Engrave. When in the ancient world, you wanted to establish a series of laws and regulations, and you wanted to display them publicly, you would etch them or engrave them into a stone. They are engraved. You are lechokek. Lechokek. So usually the term applies to just practices that are irrational. So there are chukim of the Torah. There are things that are beyond our logic in the Torah, like the burning of the red heifer, or not to wear shatnez. These are things that are beyond logic. But pagans also have those things that are beyond logic or irrational, and those are the ones that the Torah warns us don't keep. But it's fascinating that the Torah decides to link same-gender marriages to a chok. And why is it? So, to clarify that point, I'm going to ask or analyze, as mentioned, chok, which we usually use as a term for traditions that we cannot comprehend rationally, things that are statutes that you must follow. And it's related to engraving. And if you ask why, so there was an authority, Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi of Mecklenburg, the Ketava Kabbalah, and he argues the following, and he says the following, that you should know, anything that is rational, people will know to do or not to do. In other words, people will know that you don't kill another person, and people will understand rationally that if someone's going through difficulty, you are kind to them. There's no need to engrave such laws. But on the other hand, something that is not rational needs to be engraved. And therefore, the term chok is used for those things that are not rational, those things that we cannot comprehend, that they are beyond logic. That's his explanation. I have a little bit of a different approach. And that is that, do you want to know what preserves Judaism? Judaism, many of its teachings, perhaps even the bulk, are rational. They are rational. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to appreciate life, to be sure that there's life now and in the future, to be kind, to not harm his creation, to do good, to be appreciative. Those fundamentals are quite rational. The human can figure it out. You know, Thomas Aquinas tells us that you could go ahead and there's something called natural law. You look at nature, you can appreciate the higher being. The Talmud tells us that even without the Torah, we could have understood many laws and regulations by analyzing nature. True. But those things would not be preserved. If you would only base your values on reason, they would change. Because in a few decades, what was considered abnormal 30 years ago is normal today. What is considered rational today is one day going to be considered irrational. In other words, things change. If you base your faith, if you base your righteousness on what is called rational thinking, it's not going to be sustained. Torah would not be around if all of Torah was based on, what is rational. You know what preserves Torah? Those things that we don't understand. Because just as we are careful not to wear a garment that has a mixture of wool and linen, and we don't understand why, and we realize that, you know what, why we are following these things, because we're not going to fully comprehend things. And therefore, even if we see things differently one day, we're not going to make an adjustment. That preserves Torah. The things that I simply don't understand why, but I'm yet committed to them, that preserves all of the values of Judaism. And therefore, if you want to keep things etched in stone and preserved, you need a chok. You need those things that are beyond rational. That's how you preserve Judaism. And that's why we have this commitment. We ate matzah a few weeks ago. Is it rational to go ahead and eat matzah? Nope. Was I excited to do it? I actually was very excited. Shechianu, I'm alive. Mitzvah another year to eat it. Why? Because this is what keeps me connected. This is how I'm connected to the past. This is something that I'm handing over to the future. Rational, no. Preserver, boy, does it preserve our faith. When I fast on Yom Kippur and I'm thirsty late in the afternoon and I don't drink, I'm not just preserving that mitzvah, I'm preserving all of Judaism. A chok preserves. Now, with that in mind, the chok that preserves, you know, there's a fascinating statement in the Talmud that talks about Bnei Noach, the nations of the world, and their ethics and their values. And the Talmud tells us that you should know that in our region, there are three things that Gentiles do that indicates that there's still decency. There's still some decency there. The Talmud talks about three things. Now, number one, the Talmud tells us, is that they don't sell human flesh in a marketplace. I mean, there's some level of decency that they still have. Remember, this is the ancient world, a pagan society. Many flaws can be found in their behavior and lifestyles. And the Talmud points out, you know what, there's something good about them. They don't sell a pound of flesh in the marketplace. Okay. Number two, when they interact with people of faith, they still honor them. Gentiles honor people of faith. Okay, number one. Number three, the Talmud notes, of something that the Talmud tells us, yes, we're not in a perfect society, but nevertheless, the Gentiles follow this teaching, which indicates that there's values that still live on. En kotvin ktuva lezcharim, that when two males become bonded, have a relationship, they don't write a ksuva. They don't recognize it as an official marriage. What's the Talmud telling us? You know, there's a lot that changed over the past few decades in the world we live in regarding LGBT and so on. A lot has changed. Now, some of it, perhaps, believe it or not, is good. There's a percentage that's good because when people had or were born with desires that are not aligned with the desires that most people have, they were mistreated. And there's no room for that. If someone is born, it's a challenge. They should be treated with human dignity to the fullest. Human dignity applies to all humans, and it makes absolutely no difference if their orientation is different. They're at Tselem Elokim. How can we shame them, especially if they're challenged? That's fundamental. And we have to recognize that if some of them can give in to their temptation, we can't judge them. We can't. It's overwhelming. People fail. People have. It's a strong drive that we should not be judging them. And perhaps I shouldn't even use the word fail, but it's a fact. It's a reality that when there are strong desires, there's difficulty in controlling them. But what we are not willing to accept is to redefine the concept of what a marriage is. And that is wrong. If we have something that is a term, and it's a logical term, male, female, getting married, marriage, and we see sanctity in it, if it is taken away from us, and they want to call something that is not marriage, marriage, that we could say that we're not willing to accept. And, imagine if you would go into an Islamic community and start selling urinals, and you would call a specific urinal the Quran line, the Quran. And you tell people, I'm just calling the urinal a Quran. So go ahead and take care of your needs on the Quran. You know what would happen? What kind of chutzpah is it to take something that we consider holy and redefine something else? So we're not judging, but we have the right to say it's not a technical marriage. Now, if for legal reasons, two males have some kind of bond and they want some kind of tax benefit, okay, so I have no problem if the CRA goes ahead and recognizes, but give it a different term, right? For centuries upon centuries, people of faith have had a specific understanding of what a marriage is. It's not fair to us. We have to change a definition. I'm not looking down. I'm not judging you. It's your life. But don't take something away from me. And the Talmud is telling us that this is an expectation, not just from Jews, but from humanity. And there's a value, she'en kotvin ktuva l'scharim. There's a value that, they have an understanding. They have a relationship. That's their decision. But don't go ahead and make a mockery out of what's been holy for us. It's unfair. You're taking away a term that belongs to us. But the problem is that in some societies, they make it their chok. They want to engrave things that are historically not the natural. They want to engrave it. They want to legislate that it is unacceptable for someone like me to make such a statement that it's not a marriage. How dare you say it's not a marriage? They want to engrave it. They want to make it into the chok. That's the chok, that things that are values, Judeo-Christian, call it whatever you want, or nature itself really in some ways indicates otherwise. They want to accept it as a chok. That is what we are being told here. That's what the rabbis are telling us. Ubechukoteim lo telecho. Don't engrave. Don't go ahead and make traditions that cannot be changed of things that are not an ideal. That's what we're being told here. And it's something that it's difficult to talk about in this day and age because, you walk into your bank and with great pride, they show that they're very, very tolerant. I like tolerance too. Tolerance is a good thing. Treating and humans with dignity, not, God forbid, looking down. And yes, there should be associations where they could get together and get support. And if someone makes a decision to have a lifestyle, it's their decision. I'm not judging, but we could still protect. We could still protect what's ours, and bemoan the fact that there are those that have a desire to make a chok, to legislate these practices. That's what's being addressed in this parsha. There was a time that you could be a Torah Jew and look at the modern world and say, you know what, they go hand in hand. And, the values of society are very similar to the values of a rational thinking Jew. But then suddenly the world starts going in a direction that we realize that it's getting hard. In other words, if you were a Jew that rejected a college campus 70 years ago and 60 years ago, and the values of society, and believe that we have to completely detach ourselves from what's considered culture, you don't struggle so much with what's happening in the world around you today. But for those of us who do know that there's chokhmah bagoyim, and that there's wisdom, and that there's decency, and then suddenly we see the direction of where things are going in society, we have more of a problem, right? We have more of an issue. And that's what the Torah is telling us, that, you know what? You come from Mitzrayim, you're going to Canaan, yes, you are, but you're in the wilderness, and you have to keep with you that wilderness throughout your journey. The Jew has to disconnect, right? The Jew has to disconnect. And it's not always easy. Sometimes it's in the workplace that we have to go out and say, you know what, I can't go to such an event. Sometimes it's with a person that you feel a very strong connection, and you get invited to a wedding that is not based on these values. It's not easy, right? You have to treat them with dignity, but at the same time, claim that I have my values. Please respect them as well. This is the challenge that we have. And perhaps we appreciate the Torah being given in a wilderness, because wilderness symbolizes this disconnect. And at times we have to disconnect. That's a challenge that we live in. And this is the parsha that talks to us regarding this matter. So hopefully we've gained a little bit of insight from a very loaded topic and a loaded parsha. And we will, God willing, continue our learning Thursday nights for the next 8-9 weeks until July. So first of all, thank you all for joining.